Hello and welcome to Veterans of the Valley. I'm Tom Turbeville. You know John Happ for his service to our community over the years, but maybe you don't know him for his service to our country. John Happ is a flyer with some 40 combat missions in Vietnam. He loves to fly and he loves to talk about where he's been, like his some 29 landings on the ice runways of Antarctica. Welcome to Veterans of the Valley, Colonel John Happ. John, it's a pleasure to have you here. I've wanted to have you on Veterans of the Valley for a long time, and I finally got it. Your nickname is Happy, so I'm going to let you start off right now. You said that's a nickname you got even before you were born, right?
Yes, my uncle nicknamed me Happy before I was born. Said, I don't care whether it's a girl or a boy, we're going to call it Happy. And, you know, as I said earlier, I was born kind of dumb, and now I'm fat, so I'm fat, dumb, and happy, so I'm perfect.
Okay. Well, I'll call you Colonel Happ because of your service not only in Vietnam, but service for so long in the military. And, of course, that service has spilled over, as a lot of people here in the community know you as a former city councilman of the city of College Station and all the work you do. But I want to go all the way back to after you were born in Austin and you were raised in Ohio. Sort of talk about your youth. You wanted to be a baseball player, but you were a little too lightweight back then, right?
Yes, sir. Well, first of all, Tom, thank you for this great opportunity. There's been some great Americans that have been here and you've interviewed, and I feel such honored to have the opportunity to be here to talk about my career. And it was a wonderful career, and I look back at it now, especially this opportunity, and remember some really great things.
Right.
And to go back now to say, I guess what I'd really like to say is that after I was born in Austin, I spent the first 5 years of my life right here in College Station.
Mm-hmm.
And then I came back in 63 and spent another lifetime here, I felt like, getting a degree, going through the Corps. And then I came back in 93, and this is my home, and it's been so good to us, and it's such a great privilege, too, to be part of Bryan College Station.
Right. You came to A&M in the fall of 1963, and talk about your first day of school. You got here a day early by accident, and you had to find a place to sleep that first night.
I did, and I remember the bus dropping me off at Eastgate with 2 footlockers and carrying one of them 100 yards and carrying the other one 100 yards past that one. It was during, between semesters, and, you know, of course, back then, between semesters, this place was pretty well shut down.
Right.
So I spent the first night in the hospital, the old hospital, in the basement before I went to fish camp the next day.
Right, right. And you joined the Air Force ROTC as opposed to the Army ROTC. First, somebody had to tell you what ROTC stood for, and then once you figured that out, why'd you join the Air Force instead of the Army?
Well, I remember it very distinctly that the last table you go to when you registered back in the old days in Sabisa, and when we got to the last table, the young lady says, do you want Air Force ROTC or Army ROTC? And of course, being somewhat the traveling that I'd done, I didn't realize that I had to go into ROTC, so I asked her, what's ROTC? And she says, Reserve Officer Training Corps. And I'm standing there kind of trying to decide, and the young man behind me says, in the Army, you got to carry a rifle. In the Air Force, you don't have to carry a rifle. I said, I want to go in the Air Force.
That was an easy decision.
It was.
That's right. You didn't have a whole lot of money, so it was hard to get home to see your parents in Ohio, so you sort of figured out by joining the fish drill team that might be a free ticket to visit home every once in a while. Talk a little bit about that, and then I want you to go on and talk about a fellow named Bob Medina who kind of saved you and helped you become a member of the fish drill team.
Well, my opportunity there was to get a chance to go to Indiana to march in the competition in Indiana, which is not too far from Ohio, and I figured that would be one of the few ways that I would have an opportunity to go home and see my folks. And I have wonderful folks. They've taught me so much, and it's stayed with me my whole life. They're doing very well in Ohio still. I'm really pleased to still have my parents, and so I wanted to try to get there, and I went out for tryouts. And obviously back then Corps was much bigger, and we had a lot of kids come out for tryouts. And one night I was visited by, turned out to be upperclassman Bob Medina, and of course I had to whip out and meet him and find out where he was from. And he told me, he said I wasn't going to make the drill team. And of course I knew he was previous drill team. He was a sophomore and I was a freshman, but he was wearing a cord. And so I figured it's my downfall. And he said, well, do you really want to make it? And I said, yes, sir, I do. And he said, why? And I said, because I've learned in the short week that it's really an honor and a privilege to be part of the fish drill team. And he said, all right. And he taught me how to pivot, taught me how to do about face, and then gave me instructions to do square corners until the tryouts were over with. And if it hadn't been for Bob Medina, I wouldn't have made the fish drill team. And it's obviously one of the highlights of my life was to be on the fish drill team.
One great story when you were at Texas A&M was when you were about to get your commission. You were all set, ready to get the commission, but then got on the scales and you were a little bit underweight. And you had a day of eating. Talk about that.
Yeah, the nurse at the hospital, when I went over there to weigh in and got on the scales, I was a tad bit light. And she sent me back to Sabisa and said, I want you to eat every box of dry cereal and all the bananas you can eat. So I did do that and went over there. When I came back, she handed me a cup and sent me to the water cooler, and said, drink it until the water gets hot. I don't mind telling you that I was pretty well bloated from drinking all that, but I actually weighed in 129 pounds, 2 pounds over what I needed to weigh to get my
So
commission.
you made the weight, like a boxer looking to make the weight, right?
I know that's kind of hard to believe, but yeah, I was that skinny at one time.
I'm going to go back to your service in a minute, but I want to talk about, because I don't want to end this show without talking about your special relationship with Easterwood and Easterwood Airport. It's really all through your career here when you got your license. Well, I'm going to let you tell the story, but you are Director of Aviation at Easterwood Airport now. You've been with Easterwood since 1996 and Director of Aviation since 2000, but Easterwood Airport means a lot to you really throughout your career, right?
Oh, absolutely. I learned to fly there. Jack Taylor, who ran Texas Automotive at that time, helped me not only go through FIP there or the flight training program there, but pushed me pretty hard for me to go ahead and get my private license, and I did that at Easterwood. I also, right before I graduated, had the opportunity to get engaged to my wife of 40 years as of December the 27th.
Right. So your wife Carol?
My wife Carol, that's correct.
Right, right. And now you're the guy in charge there as Director of Aviation, so we could do several shows just about your job as Director of Aviation, because I know it's fascinating work. But I want to get back to your service. After Texas A&M, you were going to go to Topeka, but then somebody said, hey, why don't you go to Randolph? There's not quite the washout rate at Randolph as there was at Willie at Topeka. So talk about that, about being at Randolph. Yeah. But you didn't get to go to Randolph immediately. You had to go back home to Ohio and sort of wait out your orders, right?
Yes, sir. When we graduated, we actually were lucky enough at that time to get your choice of bases. And as you said, I had orders for Willie, which is in Arizona.
Arizona, excuse me.
And then a friend of mine who retired as a 4-star in my outfit at A&M was Pat Gamble, called me and said, why don't you go to Randolph Air Force Base and go to pilot training with me? And I said, Pat, they don't have pilot training at Randolph. And he said, well, they're gonna. And I said, yeah, but I would like to go to Willie. That's the nickname for Williams Air Force Base.
Right.
I'd like to go to Willie. That's the premier base of the Air Force. And he said, well, my dad says, and his dad was a 1-star in the Air Force, actually at that time a colonel, said that the washout rate at Willie is about 20%, but because Randolph's going to be a new flight training program, that the washout rate will be less than 10%. So I needlessly ran down the very next day and got my orders changed to go to Randolph, and it delayed my entrance date from February to May. Well, I actually didn't know when I left when I was actually going to go, but ended up going in the end of May. And so I did. I went back to Ohio and actually had a great opportunity. I had a chance to teach school before.
Right. You taught industrial art to some Amish kids, right?
Well, they were out of the Amish program. A lot of them were, yes, sir. It was right next to Black River High School, right next to Ashland County, and pretty good sized high school, but a lot of the students had come out of the Amish communities and spoke very broken English, and I think I had mentioned to you before, I think I learned as much from them as I actually taught them, because these kids had great talent with their hands.
That was very rewarding, I know.
You
went into pilot training in May of '68, got out in June of '69, and I want you to sort of backtrack, because I want to talk about one individual that you told me about that really at Texas A&M, a fellow named Marcus Hurley. And sort of when you met him, and then later when you met him again, and his sort of get back to you a little bit. Sort of take us through that story quickly, if you will.
Well, I kind of almost hate to admit this to all my classmates, but you know, it's not your privilege to take advantage of an upperclassman except for the class directly ahead of you. Mm-hmm. But I had an incident after one night at fish guillotine coming back. I was balancing the weapon on my palm of my hand, walking back to the dormitory, and this junior at the time, and I was just a freshman, told me to come up to his room and proceeded to put me through the drill. And I kind of avoided him for the rest of the time until right before his graduation. Now, I'm just a sophomore, but I saw him walking up from dorm 12 carrying his laundry. And so I went out in the hall and called for some freshmen and locked my door, and they hung his laundry in the trees. And of course, he's looking around wanting to know who did this. And so I hid, actually, very safely, so he didn't know I had done this. And so I felt really good that I got back at him for what he had done to me when I was a freshman, until we graduated from T-37s and we marched down to the T-38 hangars and walked into the T-38 flight room, and guess who one of the instructors is? And I went home that night and said, Carol, there's no way that I'm going to graduate from pilot training. And she says, why? And I said, well, because one of the instructors is Marcus Hurley, and I don't think he thinks too much of me. And so all the way through the program, he never, ever made any qualms, or I should say, he showed any preference that he even knew me. And guys would ask me, Happy, you were at A&M same time Marcus was. Didn't you know Marcus? I said, yeah, I knew Marcus and knew of him, but he was an upperclassman. I didn't have anything to do with him. Well, then the last, 2 days before graduation, I was turning in our distributing our scrapbooks that we had done, our yearbook. And I walked in the flight room, and there's a note up there, Lieutenant Happ, you're scheduled to fly at 1400 that particular day. I knew nothing about it. And of course, I'd already turned in most of my equipment, my G suit, and so I borrowed a flight suit, and I was wearing low quarters. I didn't have boots. They were at the house, and I did have my helmet that was still in the helmet room. I got my helmet, rushed back there, and walked in the room, and there stood Marcus in his G suit and his gloves and his helmet, and said, where have you been? We need to get airborne. So we got in the bus and we rode out there, and he said, just strap in, I'll do the pre-flight. And I said, well, what are we going to do? Why am I flying? He said, well, you need 210 hours to graduate, and you got 209.2. You need 8/10 of an hour. And I said, well, what are we going to do for 18? He said, well, you're going to ride. I'm going to go get proficiency. So I said, okay, great. So I got in the front seat. He got in the back seat. He pulled the tarp over for his hooded takeoff. And we got up to the altitude, and subconsciously I'm hearing him talking on the radio, but I'm enjoying the view. I never had a chance to look around before. I mean, I could see Dallas, I could see Houston, I could see San Antonio. Well, I never had a chance to look around before. I was too busy flying. And then I subconsciously hear him say that he would take Area 5 right below us, and he rolled inverted, and that's all I remembered part of that. I went down in the seat because I didn't have a G suit on, and as he was pulling about 6 Gs, he said, that'll teach you to hang my laundry.
So he had remembered.
So afterwards I asked him, I said, Marcus, how did you find out? And he said, well, I went to a football game last fall and happened to run into Fishbird, who was one of the freshmen that hung his laundry. And of course, Fishbird confessed and told him who had done it.
That's a great story. He probably remembers you, and you certainly do remember him. One of your jobs at Randolph, because you'd had a little journalism, they asked you to put out a yearbook. As a matter of fact, here is the yearbook right here that he put out, and I want to read just about from your little autobiography here in the yearbook, and let you explain this paragraph. It says, one problem kept plaguing Happy during flight training. He simply could not keep track of his possessions. After losing a Corvette and a new dog, he discovered that there are thieves abroad. So he bought a leash for his car and a burglar alarm for his dog. That's an Aggie for you. How'd you lose your dog and your Corvette?
Well, unfortunately, getting the Corvette was another story, and I'll tell you that someday. But actually had the Corvette stolen.
Oh, my goodness.
While I was in pilot training.
Yeah.
And the dog is really a great story because my mom and dad have always wanted a Maltese, and that's our favorite dog. And I happened to find one in the paper, and purchased the young dog, and we got home that night, and we lived in a courtyard area, and I opened the cage to let him get out and go to the bathroom, and he disappeared. I mean, he took off like a shot. And somebody had turned him in, and when I went down to, I almost didn't recognize him because he was almost pitch black by the time and matted and really dirty, but turned out to be my mom and dad's joy of their life. That was their first
Wow.
Maltese. They've had 3 or 4 since, but Paco was a great dog.
That's a great story. I want to look at some photographs. So we got 4 photographs to look at real quick, and then we're going to come back and we're going to talk about your service in Vietnam, and we're going to talk about Antarctica too. But these are just some photographs. Here's the first one from Texas A&M. There is young cadet John Happ. What year were you here on?
That was my freshman year, 1963, 64.
And as part of the fish drill team?
Yes, sir. It's the fish drill team uniform, and probably one of the proudest things that ever happened to me was having that opportunity to drill in Indiana, where my folks did come,
right, and
got to see the fish drill team drill, and I think we had a great team.
Okay. Tell about this picture. This picture is hanging in your office, right?
That's one of my favorite pictures. My mother was society editor to the newspaper there in town, and what it doesn't show is my wife's actually taking pictures, and it really dates us because it shows one of those plastic instant minute cameras that you used to be able to buy for $16, and she was taking pictures, and then I was unfortunately making fun of one of the pictures she had taken of me, and my mom snapped both of us at Christmas. That was my Christmas. I'm sorry, right after graduation, my junior year. I'd just gotten home from A&M, and
right,
she had asked me to put my uniform on, and so I did.
That's a wonderful picture. This was taken at Randolph, right?
Yes, sir. That's actually when we were trying to get pictures for the yearbook. I took a picture of all the cadets as we were going through with T-38s, and as I said, what a great toy, great airplane.
Right.
Enjoyed flying it very much.
Right.
And like I said, I don't remember being that skinny.
A lot of us have that problem, as a matter of fact. Then finally, here is, I guess, your official Air Force photograph.
Well, that was taken when I was at Scott Air Force Base as Director of Acquisition right before I moved here.
Right. John, talk about Vietnam. You served there, some 40 combat missions in Vietnam. You wanted to fly a fighter. You never got to do that as much as you wanted. You were a C-130 pilot for most of your time. But talk about your service in Vietnam. Some 19 months you spent in country. Is that right?
I actually was stationed in CCK, or Ching Chang Kong Air Base in Taiwan, and we would rotate in at 15 days at a time. And that way we weren't really counted as part of being assigned to Vietnam. We were actually outside of Vietnam, assigned there. But I did have the opportunity to fly C-130 missions in Vietnam, a lot of resupply and cargo, and what a great tactical airplane. I got to do a few tactical things while I was there. We actually took a combat control team up north of Quang Tri. When I took them into there and came back out, the next time I went back in, it was unbelievable. There must have been 2,000 tents, and it was a reorganization just north of Quang Tri, which is in the very north province of North Vietnam. Then I had the opportunity, which I can't talk a whole lot about, I had the opportunity to fly a classified mission. I did that for almost 10 months, my last 10 months there.
Right. So when we talk about 40 combat missions, those are the ones that count.
Those are the ones that I could report.
That you can report.
But you flew
tell us what you can tell us about your job and the classified missions in Vietnam. I know it's limited what you still to this day can actually divulge.
Well, I think the kind of missions that we flew were unmarked aircraft. We had no markings. We flew without any identification, so it ought to give you some idea of some of the places that we had the opportunity to go into. And that's what makes this airplane so great, and why I enjoyed the mission so much, is it's so versatile and so flexible that you can use it for a lot of different things, and I got a great chance to do that.
Yeah. Were the missions dangerous missions? I mean, were they missions that you...
I think they would have been dangerous if we'd have been captured.
Right.
Yes, sir.
Yeah, yeah. Well, again, I mean, thank you for that. Obviously, that's a part that you'll take with you, you know, your whole life. And and certainly understand that. I came back from Vietnam. You'd been there for 18, 19 months. You came back in 1972. Talk a little bit about your post-Vietnam career, and eventually I want to, you have such a diverse background. You spent some time in New Zealand. Once you figured out where New Zealand was, that was just one of the great couple of years of your life. Talk about that, because you got to fly a whole lot when you and your wife lived in New Zealand.
Yes, sir, I did. I had a great opportunity to be an exchange pilot, and during that time I got to fly in the Queen's Jubilee and got to fly Queen Elizabeth's, actually flew a Rolls Royces more than I had the opportunity to be with her, but flew all over the South Pacific, went to nearly every island in the South Pacific. The Kiwis, or the New Zealanders, they use that airplane, again, very, very versatile aircraft. They used it as passenger runs, they would use it for cargo runs, and spent a lot of, I actually probably spent more time away from New Zealand than I did the whole time I was there. It's a beautiful country, beautiful people. What a great opportunity that both my wife and son and I had to have 2 years in New Zealand.
Yeah, you said you flew nearly 1,100 hours in 19 months. So that's an awful lot of flying. And you got to fly an awful lot of places.
To go anywhere from New Zealand is almost an overnight flight.
Right,
in a 130, yes, sir.
I know we're kind of hopping around with your career, but at Dice Air Force Base, one of the jobs that you had was as a test pilot, and you got to fly some 50 brand new planes from Lockheed.
I picked up 50 new H models, and delivered them to Abilene right before I went to New Zealand. So had a great opportunity to go through maintenance officer school and get my test pilot rating, and actually flew test tops. Right,
and with some of those, you had some brand new co-pilots with you, and that instruction part of it you enjoyed also.
I did. I tried to fly with the young new co-pilots, because you had a chance to shut down all 4 engines and stall that aircraft, and they don't get to do that in training, but during test tops, and had the opportunity to do that quite often on the full phase flights.
I want you to tell a story, and then we're going to talk about Antarctica. When you came back to College Station finally for the final time in 1993, talk about a trip that you made to Austin and a fellow you ran into.
Well, it has to do with flying those test tops and flying with co-pilots. I went to Austin in '93 as Colonel Happ to do a recruiting mission for the Corps, and while I was there, a gentleman came up behind me and tapped me on the shoulder and said, "Colonel, are you the John Happ that was a captain in Dice in '73?" And I said, "Yes." And he said, "Well, you scared me to death." Well, it really made me kind of feel bad, because I thought I was a better pilot than that. But he said, I said, "How did I scare you?" And he said, "Well, my first flight there was as a co-pilot in these test tops, and you were the test pilot, and you briefed on Friday night about we were going to stall the airplane and shut down all 4 engines." And he said, "Saturday morning came, and I didn't sleep at all Friday night." He said, "I was scared to death." And it turned out to be, which is now our governor, Governor Perry. So
he was secretary. He was an agriculture commissioner back then. So I guess you see him from time to time, and he still reminds you of that, right?
I do, yes, sir.
We got about 3.5 minutes left. Not enough time to talk about Antarctica, but you made some 29 flights into Antarctica, and weather and conditions and things like that was a big deal as far as flying into Antarctica. But what an experience! Talk about it.
Well, there's no forecasted weather there. You have to go by trends and how the weather is, and it can be a beautiful sunny day, but if you have 7 knots of wind, you start getting obscuration. At 9 knots of wind, it's partial obscuration. 11 knots of wind, it's a whiteout. You can't see me and you standing this close to each other when it's a whiteout. It's about 18 foot deep to 20 feet deep if the winds pick up, and it'd be sunny above it. And then that sun causes the refraction and reflection of the light in those ice crystals.
Right. Right, and you learned some ice survival while you were there.
I did.
Also.
I had the opportunity to go through survival twice. Once before I went down, then I took the Australians through, trained a bunch of Australians to start flying down there.
And I was right, when you landed on some of these runways, they were actually floating runways?
Correct. The ice runway, we call it, has to be 116 inches thick, but it's actually out in the bay area away from what land there is. But that's just the ice shelf, and we go out and land on the runway that's been cut level with a bulldozer, but it's actually more than 116 inches of ice.
You talked about while you were there, sometimes the whiteouts were so bad that you actually had to follow ropes so you wouldn't get lost. You could be 3 feet away from one of your houses there and
You
not
wouldn't
know where
know
you
it.
were.
You wouldn't know it. No, sir. It was the first time down there. I'll never forget it. It was awesome. As far as you could see, everything was white.
Wow.
As far as you could see,
Wow.
there's no depth perception whatsoever. Very, very few shadows. Obviously no trees. Not many buildings, especially close to the runway. So.
John Happ, talk about your family real quick in the last minute that we have. Of course, your wife Carol. Talk about the rest of your family.
Wife Carol's a principal in Bryan, and I'm so proud of her. She's a Blue Ribbon School twice. Mm-hmm. And my son John has his own business in Houston and doing very well. And he's a graduate of '93, or class of '93, and really proud of him and his wife Nellie, who's a kind of a TV star in Houston. So, and I have a grandson Jackson, who I'm very, very proud of. He's 5 years old.
I know, and they're very proud of you, and we're proud of you. Thank you very much for your service. 30 minutes goes awfully quickly. We could do several shows on your service, and thank you very much for joining us, John.
Thank you. What a great opportunity to visit with you.
All right, thank you. A little wonder that John Happ's passion for flying has landed him in a job that he loves as Director of Aviation at Easterwood Airport. We salute John Happ for his service as an Air Force officer, as a former member of the College Station City Council, and as a very, very valued citizen of the Brazos Valley. I'm Tom Turbeville. Join us next time on Veterans of the Valley.
In honor of the veterans who have served our country